Imagine living in a major city where your local legal system is just um, constantly wrestling with the federal government for its own identity.
Right. It is a pretty wild concept to wrap your head around.
Totally. Well, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to thoroughly analyze the profound structural changes introduced by the District of Columbia Court Reform and Criminal Procedure Act of 1970.
Which is quite a mouthful, but a really crucial piece of legislation.
Definitely. And for our sources today, we are heavily relying on an incredibly detailed legal review by Stephen M. Schneebaum. He examines the really unique constitutional foundations of the judicial branch in the nation's capital.
Yeah, and Schneebaum's work is fantastic because it forces you to reconsider how you think about local government. I mean, we usually just take for granted that the city we live in has the authority to manage its own basic affairs.
Right. You just assume your city council and mayor are in charge of the local courts.
Exactly. But the United States Constitution explicitly grants Congress the power to govern the nation's capital.
Okay, let's unpack this. The Constitution gave Congress exclusive legislative power over D.C. But here's the thing. They didn't provide a blueprint for how to actually run its courts.
Right. They basically just said, you are in charge, figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. Which, as you can imagine, led to a long history of experimental and, honestly, often deeply flawed models for the D.C. judicial system.
It really did. And before we get into the details of what the 1970 Act actually changed, we kind of have to establish why a massive overhaul was even necessary in the first place.
To set the stage for you listening at home, yeah.
Right. So prior to 1970, the courts in D.C. were this really confusing hybrid creature. They had what federal courts later described as a dual character.
A dual character, so they were trying to be two things at once.
Exactly. On one hand, they handled local municipal issues, everyday stuff like traffic violations or minor property disputes.
Right.
But on the other hand, they were firmly planted in the federal judicial system, meaning decisions made on strictly local matters were actually appealable to federal Article III courts.
Wait, really? So a minor neighborhood dispute could end up in front of a high-level federal judge?
Yes. It was a massive entanglement. And Congress even assigned these hybrid courts entirely non-judicial tasks just because it was convenient for them.
Like what kind of tasks?
Well, Schneebaum notes that back in 1865, Congress directed the local court to appoint a commission to oversee the compilation of voter lists.
Oh, wow. Compiling voter lists is definitely not a judicial function.
No, not at all. It is purely administrative. But the real catalyst for change, the thing that broke the system, was the late 1960s.
Right, because D.C. was no longer just a quiet enclave for government workers.
Exactly. It had become a major city dealing with really intense urban challenges. And following the 1968 riots, there was this perceived proliferation of crime.
Yeah.
The courts just could not handle the volume.
Right, the system just completely gridlocked. I remember reading the testimony from Mayor Walter Washington from July 1969.
Oh, yeah, his testimony was shocking.
He told Congress that over 1,000 people were incarcerated, simply awaiting trial or sentencing.
1,000.
Yeah, just sitting in jail because of this massive backlog in the federal courts.
Good hair.
It actually makes me think of an analogy to explain this pre-1970 mess.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think of it like a huge global corporation. You have an HR department, right?
Right.
And their job is strictly local payroll, employee disputes, that kind of thing.
Makes sense.
But then corporate leadership suddenly tells HR, hey, you also need to run our entire global supply chain.
That is a terrible management decision.
Right. Structurally, it is way too tangled to function efficiently. So when a crisis hits, like the late 60s crime spike in D.C., the system simply paralyzes. You cannot do the local HR work, and you cannot ship the global products.
That is a really great way to look at it. And what's fascinating here is that the pressure of this failing municipal system is what finally forced Congress to act. It wasn't about constitutional purity. It was just a practical emergency.
Because the hybrid system was literally collapsing under the weight of municipal crime.
Exactly. Congress realized they needed to build a dedicated local system from scratch, which leads directly to the 1970 Act.
Right, the District of Columbia Court Reform and Criminal Procedure Act. It was basically a surgical intervention, wasn't it?
It really was. It created an absolute clean separation of local and federal judicial functions. They established two brand new Article I courts.
The Superior Court and the District of Columbia Court of Appeals.
Yes, and those were formally inaugurated on January 1st, 1971.
And just to be clear, These Article 1 courts were completely separated from the Article 3 U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia, right?
Completely separated. And separated from the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit, too. The act specifically assimilated the D.C. Court of Appeals to the highest court of a state.
Okay.
And it assimilated the Superior Court to state trial courts. They were meant to look and function exactly like state courts.
Okay, well, that actually brings up a huge point. If Congress made these new Article 1 courts exactly like state courts to handle the municipal backlog, does that mean the judges got the exact same protections as federal judges?
No, they absolutely did not, and that is a critical distinction.
Because federal judges under Article 3 have lifetime tenure, right?
Right. Lifetime tenure and constitutional protections against having their salaries reduced. It ensures their total independence. But judges in these new D.C. Article 1 courts were only given 15-year terms.
Wow, just 15 years.
Yep. And at the time, they were even subject to a mandatory retirement age of 70.
So they are handling major local crimes, but operating on a ticking clock.
Exactly. Now, Congress did try to give the illusion of local control. The act established the Joint Committee on Judicial Administration.
And that was made up of local judges?
Exclusively local judges, yeah. They oversaw personnel, budgets, training, things like that. The act also created a commission on judicial disabilities and tenure.
Okay, so it looks like they are handing the keys over to the locals.
It looks like it, yes. But the act was emphatically not a home rule measure. It retained the requirement that the U.S. president nominates these local judges, and the U.S. Senate confirms them.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You can see this glaring hypocrisy in how Congress debated this.
Oh, the debates were definitely revealing.
Yeah, Congress deliberately built these courts to act like those of a state to handle heavy municipal burdens. But when it came to giving up the appointment power, they conveniently switched to treating D.C. like a mere city.
Right, like Representative Edith Green's argument.
Exactly. She was on the House floor arguing against local appointment, and she claimed D.C. was just a city and mayors don't appoint judges.
Which is such a flawed analogy. Schneebaum points this out perfectly. If she had just substituted the word state for city and governor for mayor, her entire argument falls apart.
Because governors appoint state Supreme Court judges all the time.
Exactly. But they use that state-city paradox to justify keeping the presidential appointment power completely out of the hands of local officials.
Just totally preserving federal control.
Yeah, and this raises an important question. Because the 1970 Act created these powerful Article 1 courts without giving their judges Article 3 protections, it was basically a ticking time bomb for a constitutional challenge.
Right, because if you give a judge the power to take away someone's liberty, but you don't give them the protections that ensure a fair trial.
Someone is going to sue.
Exactly. Which brings us to the 1973 Supreme Court case, Palmore v. United States. This was the ultimate constitutional stress test for the 1970 Act.
It really was. Roosevelt Palmer was a defendant convicted in the brand new Superior Court.
What was the charge?
He was convicted of carrying an unregistered firearm, and he appealed it all the way to the Supreme Court.
And his argument wasn't about his innocence, right? It was about the structure of the court itself.
Exactly. He argued his trial was unconstitutional because he was prosecuted under laws passed by Congress.
Right.
Therefore, he argued he was entitled to an Article 3 judge with lifetime tenure and salary protections. He felt those protections were necessary for a fair trial.
I mean, you can kind of see his point.
Yeah.
You were in a courtroom created by Congress, being prosecuted under laws written by Congress, but the judge doesn't have the independence of an Article 3 federal judge.
It is a very logical argument from a defendant's perspective. But Justice White, who wrote the opinion for an 8-1 Supreme Court, completely dismissed the appeal.
8-1. That is barely even a debate among the justices.
Not at all. The court ruled that under Congress's plenary power over the district, Article 1 courts are perfectly constitutional.
Even for criminal trials.
Yes. Justice White pointed out that state courts, which usually don't have lifetime tenure for their judges, regularly handle federal questions.
Oh, I see.
So because states do it, D.C.'s Article 1 courts can do the same thing without violating the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause.
So what does this all mean? It sounds like Palmore fundamentally validated the entire structural premise of the 1970 Act.
It absolutely did. It cemented the rule that an Article 1 court can exercise plenary judicial functions.
So the whole surgical separation we talked about earlier was deemed legally bulletproof.
Exactly. But if we connect this to the bigger picture, the 1970 Act actually left one massive, completely unresolved gap in the criminal justice process.
A gap. We just said the structure was validated.
The judicial structure was validated. But the 1970 Act was entirely silent on the prosecutorial function.
Wait, silent? They didn't mention prosecutors at all.
Not a word. And as a result, the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia retains principal responsibility for prosecuting almost all local D.C. crimes.
The U.S. Attorney. But that is a federal officer reporting to the U.S. Attorney General.
Exactly. So local crimes are prosecuted by the federal government. Prosecutions are quite literally brought in the name of the United States.
That is wild. How do they justify that legally?
It relies on a legal fiction. The idea is that violations of the local D.C. code are actually crimes against the nation itself.
Okay, I have to push back on that.
Go for it.
If the 1970 Act went through all the trouble to create a purely local Article I court system to solve local municipal issues,
Right.
how does it make any logical sense that a federal prosecutor is the one standing in that courtroom representing the government?
It does.
It completely contradicts the idea of a separated local justice system. You have a local judge, but a federal prosecutor for a local shoplifting case.
I completely agree. And Schneebaum points this out as a glaring contradiction. It doesn't align with the local jurisdiction of the new courts. But the federal grip remains.
So to summarize all of this for you listening, the 1970 Court Reform and Criminal Procedure Act was this necessary surgical intervention. It modernized a failing system by creating dedicated Article I courts.
Right. It fixed the backlog and separated the courts.
But it intentionally retained immense federal control over local justice, from the president appointing the judges to the U.S. attorney prosecuting the cases.
Exactly. Which brings us to a pretty stunning realization about the nature of this power.
Yeah. I want to leave you all with a final provocative thought today. Think about this. Since the entire judicial structure of D.C., from the Article I courts to the federal prosecutors, was created strictly by federal statute.
Just regular laws passed by Congress?
Exactly. Yeah. Doesn't that mean Congress could, theoretically, rewrite the law tomorrow? They could pass a new bill and hand all appointment and prosecutorial powers directly to the local citizens.
They absolutely could. They wouldn't even need to amend the Constitution to do it.
It is incredible. It really highlights the sheer untapped power of legislative discretion. D.C. is basically living under a system that Congress could fundamentally reinvent on a whim.
It is a city that is always wrestling with the federal government for its own identity, like you said at the start.
Definitely something to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.